Known for his brilliant songwriting, his extraordinary guitar playing, and his haunting and lovely songs, Richard Thompson has garnered a longtime cult following and is considered one of the top 20 guitarists of all time by Rolling Stone. Now, in his first memoir, he lyrically chronicles the start of his legendary career. In this intimate memoir, Thompson recreates the spirit of the 60s as he found and then lost and then found his way again, and takes us inside life on the road in the UK and the US, crossing paths and occasionally sharing the stage with the likes of Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Jimi Hendrix, and more. Richard Thompson is a world-celebrated and influential guitarist, singer, and songwriter. His widely beloved early work within the band Fairport Convention revived British folk traditions. His albums and performances with Linda Thompson are legendary. He continues to write and perform classic songs and albums and tour widely. Richard, it is a thrill to welcome you tonight and for Gramercy Books to share your memoir with our Central Ohio community.
Well, thank you.
And Richard, in conversation with you is Alec Wightman. Alec's passion and knowledge of music, particularly rock and roll, runs long and deep. By day, Alec is a partner in the national law firm, Baker Hostetler, but during his free time, he promotes national act singer-songwriter concerts in Columbus, and he's been doing that since 1995. He's also a longtime member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where he served 3 years as chair of the board. And Alec has his own memoir just out that's now available at Gramercy Books called Music in My Life. Alec is a huge fan of your work, Richard, and the perfect person to be in conversation about Beeswing. Alec, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure. Richard, we missed the sound check, so it's nice.
Oh,
it's nice
we
to
did.
Well, and thanks to all of you in our audience for your patience and for joining us this evening. Now, a warm, warm welcome to Richard Thompson in conversation with Alec Wightman.
Well, thank you very much, Linda and Richard. It is an absolute pleasure. It's a pleasure and an honor to spend the next hour or so conversing with you about your wonderful memoir. I've been a music fan for a long time, and I can assure the folks on this call that there are very few musicians who combine the skills as a guitarist, a recording artist, a live performer, and a songwriter that you do. So if we can, let's spend some time talking about those aspects of your career. They're hopelessly intertwined. And it's all right. Let's start right at the beginning. I'd like to talk guitar and some of your influences, and let's go all the way back and tell me a little bit about your father. If we'd had a chance to do our sound check, I was going to share with you that my father, like yours, was born in Glasgow. And
really?
I love the line that your father was a typical exile, more Scottish than the average Scot. Because my dad, if somebody with a Scottish brogue came in within 100 yards of him, he fell into a deep one. And he had a library of Scottish books, and it was all about Scotland. But tell us about your father, and he introduced you to the guitar, and what was your relationship like?
Well, my relationship with my father was actually quite difficult, but he did have some wonderful records. So I was listening to those from the age of 0, really. He had Les Paul records, he has Django Reinhardt records, plus some other Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, some other wonderful jazz records, in among the other stuff, in among the crap and the less interesting stuff. So that was kind of in the background as I was growing up, so that was coming through one wall of my bedroom. Coming through the other wall of my bedroom was my sister's records. My sister was 5 years older than me, and was very keen on rock and roll when it first hit Britain's shores in 1956. So suddenly there was this exciting music, from Jerry Lee and Elvis and Buddy Holly. Lots of Buddy Holly. My sister had everything by Buddy Holly. So being a Scot, my father also love Scottish music. So I heard a lot of Scottish dance music when I was a kid, and we'd frequently take our holidays in Scotland, and I'd hear the bagpipes quite a lot. Sometimes, military bands, sometimes just a lone piper, out in the country with the sound, wafting around the hills, that extraordinary, outdoor effect, or where the wind blows and the sound kind of phases and shifts a little bit. And so that was really some of my earliest musical memories, and I think in some ways that really formed my taste, from an early age. So by the time I was a teenager, although it was all basically rock and roll, I did have this other stuff in there as well that got expressed sometimes. Especially like kind of like the drones of Scottish music. I found myself playing it, instinctively without really thinking about it.
My father took us to see the Black Watch every time they came to Cleveland, where I grew up. And I still remember him playing the albums of Kenneth McKellar over and over and over again in the house. So I had the Scottish influence early as well. You say in the book that by the time I think you said you were 6, you were very shy. You developed a stutter. How did music help you work through those challenges?
Well, first of all, I think it gave me a refuge, and then it was a place I could go where I felt kept persecuted. I mean, your school friends can be very cruel, if you have a stutter. So it was a nice refuge to lose myself in the world of music, and then when I became a player, and I could get up on stage, that gave me confidence, and made me feel that I could actually excel at something, and other people might actually envy me rather than me envying other people not having that speech disability. So music's a great healer anyway, as we know. It heals all kinds of things, and it definitely helped me to find a way forwards in my early life.
We'll come back and ask you a bunch of questions about you, but I love talking to great guitar players, and it gives me an opportunity to ask them about some other guitar players, and that's easier to do when those folks are no longer with us. But in your book, you talk about Bert Jansch. And the truth is, as a big rock and roll fan, I missed him. I missed Pentangle. I knew the band. I didn't really listen to him. But a few years ago, I saw Neil Young solo acoustic at Carnegie Hall. And he said Bert was the finest acoustic guitar player he had ever heard. Tell me about Bert and
I could tell you about the kind of progression of acoustic guitar players in Britain. I mean, there was a guy called Davy Graham who really kicked the door down. He was the first one out of the gate as a very accomplished, very interesting acoustic guitar player, and his style was expressed like Scottish folk music, jazz, North African music, Indian music, all in this incredible mix. And he influenced the next generation. I can't even say generation. I mean, people just a few years younger than him, like Bert Jansch and Martin Carthy, who were both great individualists. Bert's style was somewhere between kind of blues and folk, and again a bit of jazz in there as well. And Bert was I mean, it certainly influenced Neil Young, influenced Paul Simon as a guitar player. When Paul Simon was over in the UK in 62, 63. I think everybody really takes it from those 3 acoustic guitar players, and I saw all 3 of them at some point. For better for worse, I think that Davy Graham had a bit of a substance problem. Bert had a bit of a drink problem, so sometimes you had to get those people on a good night. But when they were good, they were very good.
Well, speaking of guitar players with substance challenges, I know nothing about playing guitar other than what my ear tells me, and I was always, from the early days, struck by the music of Mike Bloomfield. And you mentioned Bloomfield in your book. What was he to you?
He was really exciting. I'd seen the guitar players around the London blues scene, if you like, you know, John Mayall's Blues Breakers with Eric Clapton, and then with Peter Green, you know, and Mike Bloomfield just seemed more individualistic. He didn't seem to be copying anybody, whereas I felt that, you know, the English guys were copying Buddy Guy really more than anybody else. And I saw the Battlefield Blues Band playing in a little club in North London. Probably held about 200 people, maybe 300 tops. And I was so impressed with the whole band. I mean, the whole band were incredible. Paul Butterfield was amazing, harmonica player. And they had Howlin' Wolf's old rhythm section, you know, they kind of started the whole show very quietly. This also impressed me, that the fact they had this real sense of dynamic, and then they got louder and louder and louder and louder. They just progressively cranked it up. It was incredibly exciting. And Bloomfield was just great. He was such an exciting player to watch, and he was so inside the music. He was so dedicated to what he was playing. And he'd studied with you know, the Chicago Masters. You know, he'd been there, hanging out with Big Joe Williams and people. I mean, it was yeah, exceptional musician. And he passed away far too young, sadly.
Well, talking about passing away far too young, and talking about great originals, I have to ask you about Hendrix. In the book, you tell some stories about interacting with Jimi when he was in London. Stealing your words, I think you said a lot of the other guitar players, you know, would see him and try to emulate him, and I think you said you jumped sideways. What did Jimi Hendrix do to you?
Well, he was many things. I mean, he intimidated everybody on the British guitar scene. Because he really seemed to be more like the real thing. You know, I mean, Eric Clapton, wonderful guitar player, Peter Green, wonderful guitar player, and but Jimi seemed somehow more authentic. If you're going to be a blues player, he seemed more like an authentic blues player, and a great blues player. But he also had all those other dimensions. He had the feedback. He had the kind of, you know, the sort of John Coltrane kind of effects going. And plus he was a, you know, very good singer, really good arranger. I mean, that's an underrated talent, and a good composer. He wrote great songs. You know, he was you know, he was superb on all fronts, really. And I think I mean, for me, I thought, well, I'm not going to compete with this guy. Because I can't, you know, I'll do something. I'll try and sound different. I'll have different influences. I'll be a different kind of guitar player to Jimi. Plus, you know, he could always upstage you.
Yeah.
You know, he could always do something more extreme. He could play behind his back. He could play with his teeth. You know, he could he could always bring out the real showman. You know, so you're never going to compete with that.
I think I've seen you in concert dozens of times, but I don't think I've ever seen you play guitar with your teeth. You do a lot of incredible things, but I don't think I've seen you do that.
I can.
I'm sure you can. Maybe we'll test that before the evening is over.
Okay, I can play behind my back as well, but you know, it's whether you really want to. Yeah, is the question, you know.
Well, let me toss a couple other things at you, that just things that were in the book that made me smile. You and I are about the same age. What was it like growing up in London in 63, 64, 65, that first wave of what we call the British invasion? Those guys were all a few years older than you. And I want to ask a specific question. You make a reference in the book to the Rolling Stones, you not considering the Rolling Stones to be a great live band, that they made, you know, they had a genius for making records, but you didn't find them to be all that great of a live band, which seemed counterintuitive to me. But talk about that era right before you were still a kid, and these guys were all great.
Well, I was a kid. I mean, I was quite young when I saw the Rolling Stones play live at Eel Pie Island, which is this legendary club on an actual island in the middle of the River Thames in Richmond. And you know, I'd already heard Chuck Berry, and I'd already heard Bo Diddley, and I thought these guys don't get it. They're not getting the nuance. of those those Chuck Berry records, those Bo Diddley records. There's a subtlety, particularly to the rhythm. You listen to a Chuck Berry record, and there's a kind of a bounce to it, there's a jump to it, and some of it comes from the great Willie Dixon playing bass in some cases. Johnny Johnson or Lafayette Leak playing piano on those records. But it's mostly, it's a lot bit between the guitar and the drums. That sometimes the guitar is playing in 6/8, is playing shuffle time, and the drums are playing straight time. So there's this tension between the two, and the music is kind of in this crack bit between straight and shuffle, and it's a subtle thing. The Bo Diddley beat is a very subtle thing when Bo Diddley plays it, and the Rolling Stones kind of played it backwards. It should be chunk 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 chunk, and the Stones are playing chunkity chunk 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 chunk. It's more like shaving a haircut 2 bits. Kind of rhythm. So I thought, they're learning off records and they're getting it wrong. So I was a snob, as you can tell. I was a bit of a musical snob at this point. So I thought, well, they're not as good impersonators as some of the other bands around the London scene. I preferred like the Downliners sect, who were I thought a very good band. So Cyril Davis All Star. So that was a really great British blues band that only cut 4 sides, but they're really very, very good Chicago style blues. So that was my opinion of the Rolling Stones from a live point of view. And in the book, I mentioned seeing them in the studio and how actually, they very determinedly and painstakingly would put records together. And you wouldn't think so when you hear the records, but they had a real kind of, I think, genius for finding great grooves on record. Jumping Jack Flash, or Street Fighting Man. I mean, these are really great records. I think Street Fighting Man, they took a cassette recording that Keith and Charlie had done in a hotel room. Just Charlie on like a practice drum set that kind of all the drums fit inside each other, and you just just have something to play in the hotel room, and Keith playing acoustic guitar, but the acoustic guitar all sounds kind of distorted, but because they're playing it into a boombox, so that they record the drums and guitar on this boombox. And that's the kind of demo, and then they go in the studio and they can't get the same feel. So they're basically they take the cassette and they use that as the basis of the rhythm section, and then they overdub onto the cassette. So when the song starts, it goes, you hear all this terrible hiss at the front of the track because it's all this kind of cassette, messy noise, but it's just a great groove. It's a fantastic record. Anyway,
when you started, you didn't gravitate to the blues. I mean, like most rock and rollers, you started in a cover band yourself, but the stuff you were doing was the Lovin' Spoonful, the Byrds. You mentioned, interestingly to me, Tim Hardin, Tim Buckley, Phil Oakes, who was, raised in no small measure here in Columbus, Ohio, as you may know.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, that's right.
How did you gravitate to that in London, England?
I think, well, first of all, we wanted to be a different kind of band. We didn't want to be like all the other bands in London, so that led us in different directions. And also we felt very connected to to folk music and roots music forms, really. So we were always listening to to traditional music. So we listened to country music, which nobody listened to in those days. Nobody listened to country music. And we love the Lovin' Spoonful because being interpreters of and popularizers of traditional forms. And we love the Byrds because the Byrds were starting to sing intelligent lyrics in popular music. Excuse me. I suppose Dylan started it with well, whatever it was. No, actually, maybe the Byrds started. I suppose Mr. Tambourine Man was one of the first, records, a pop single that had really intelligent, poetic lyrics. And Fairport fell in love with that kind of approach, and so we sought out the great singer-songwriters and covered their songs before we became writers ourselves.
And you did become writers. You said in the book, like most great cover bands, to get credibility, you had to write your own stuff. I have to ask a question. There's a little kind of a throwaway footnote on page 73 of your book about the muse. And I don't know whether anybody else catches that when they read the book, but who was the muse? You may know a kind of an obscure Bob Dylan song, Eternal Circle, about him on stage, and sees the girl in the crowd, and by the time the song is over, the girl is gone. Who was the muse that tiptoed into your life apparently one time?
Well, we were at a rehearsal. I think we were like 15 years old. It was my school band, and we were rehearsing in a church hall, and a few girls, to turn up to watch us rehearse. It's something that happened from time to time, and there's this one girl who, as far as I'm concerned, was the white goddess, as described by Robert Graves. She was deathly pale, bright red lips, jet black hair, and she just stared at me for the whole rehearsal. Just stared at me and stared at me, and then she disappeared, and no one knew who she was. No, I don't think anyone else saw her. But there she was, and to say it disturbed me is an understatement. I was very, very disturbed by this girl. As far as I was concerned, she was some like pagan goddess, I still believe that, actually. I see you laughing, but I took it very seriously.
It caught me in the book. I'm laughing because it's an interesting story, but it obviously made your book.
Yeah, well, it was it was a big deal for me, and I pay her homage frequently.
Yeah. Well, you went from a cover band, and then a band, really gravitating towards that American rock and roll and singer-songwriter stuff, to your contemporary versions of traditional British and Irish songs, and writing your own songs like that. You kind of compare a little bit, I think, of what you were doing to what the band was doing in this country. Music from Big Pink, that whole thing, did that impact you?
Well, it really did. When that record came out, it really changed a lot of bands in the UK, their approach to music, because it was so honest. I think it was just really honest, roots-derived music, and the band were masters of all those styles. They were masters of blues, R&B, country, jazz, gospel, and all these styles, traditional American styles, were in there in this perfect mix, and they were writing great songs. Robbie Robertson was writing these great songs that drew on all those roots. And for Fairport, it was like this awakening where we thought, this is so good, in a sense, that this is what we aspire to. But we can't be the band. I mean, they were Canadian, but they'd conquered North American music styles. So we said we should really be playing a kind of music that we can excel at, and it has to be based really on something that's a bit more homegrown. We have to base it on British traditional music forms, and we'll wed that to rock music. We'll play that with amplifiers and drums, and see what that sounds like. So we kind of moved in that direction, and then when we had our traffic accident, we went at it full tilt. We made a album called Legion Leaf, which was a kind of statement of intent that this was a new musical form, new musical genre. And I think, in a sense, we didn't really look back from that. We were writing songs much more in that style, where we were playing more traditional music, and I suppose, in a sense, I'm still there. I'm still doing the same thing. I'm still in that hinterland between rock music and traditional music, British traditional music. And it's a fertile field to be plowing.
Mhm. You know, it's hard to even ask a question about the accident. You write very directly, very personally about it in the book. Was that therapeutic for you to write that? Was that you know, a story you've carried with you and not talked a lot about when you wrote this book? I'm just curious.
Well, it was an effort to write it.
I bet.
You know, I think I thought I dealt with it and kind of put it away. Not something I wanted to think about, you know, every day of my life. But having to write the book, I knew I would have to deal with this and write about it. And I tried to write about it as honestly as possible. And I suppose it was painful to write it, but there might have been some healing in doing it. There might have been something cathartic for me in doing that. I think also for our drummer's family, Martin Lamble's family, and Ginny Franklin's family, it might be more information for them that they maybe didn't know, and you know, how precious they were as human beings to us, you know. And I mean, I still think about those people, you know, not necessarily the pain of the accident, but think about them as human beings frequently.
Tell us about Sandy Denny. You talked about, she said she was tough. She drank. She swore. I think you called her an extraordinary bundle of contradictions. The band fired her.
Mhm.
You remained close. You ended up, you know, producing at least one album for her.
Mhm.
What was she like? I mean, this is a talent that is a lot of people missed.
And it's a shame. Sandy should have been up there with, you know, Carole King or something, or, you know, Joni Mitchell, you know, one of the great singer-songwriters and recognized as such. Unfortunately, I don't think she ever made records that had that kind of broader appeal. And perhaps her songs were sometimes too obscure in their meaning. But she was extraordinary. I mean, she's an absolutely great singer. I can't think of a better singer that I've ever heard, and certainly not a better one I've ever worked with. You know, she had extraordinary ability. You know, great range, great dynamic range as well, and it had a kind of unique emotion in her voice that's unmistakable, that you don't hear in other people. And it's hard to describe what that emotion is, but she was an emotional human being, and she managed to put something of that into the singing. And she owned songs. You could give a song to Sandy and she'd sing it, and you'd say, well, I don't ever want to hear anybody else sing that song. She's absolutely nailed it. And certainly the songs of mine that I took to the band for Sandy to sing, it was just the first time she ever sang anything, you think, well, that's it, you know, she's done it. She's communicated that to the world, to the audience. But she was, I mean, as a human being, she was a bundle of contradictions. She was, I suppose, neurotic. She was up and down. It could be really, really funny, hilariously funny, or could be in tears the next minute. You know, she's insecure about her looks, sometimes insecure about her music. Yeah, and then, you know, you know, I mean, she'd always drank a bit, but she drank more and more as time went on. Took drugs more and more as time went on, and really lost control of herself, I think, really. And you know, her end was really tragic. Yeah. And she died at 31 years old, which is far too young.
You and Ian Matthews remained friends. I have to ask, just because he's important to me, what was it like opening for Dion in New York City in the early 70s?
Well, it was a mess of a tour.
The stories are hilarious.
Oh my
Maybe
God,
that's funny to you, but
yeah. And that's just the stuff I could write about without getting sued. It was a crazy tour, but the week that we did with Dion was with Shelter from the Storm. It was a kind of solace. Dion was and is, I mean, still is just a wonderful human being. I mean, a great singer and a fabulous songwriter, and just a very down to earth person, like very unpretentious. Yeah. It's sort of like a dream musician, in so many ways. Someone you'd be happy to play with or jam with or anything, and I have the greatest respect for him. And he's still making great music. I hope when we all come out of this year, this pandemic year, that then he'll be still out there playing. He's a wonderful guy.
There is no question.
Yeah.
Well, let me, we've got to keep our eye on the clock a little bit here, so I'm going to move forward a little. One of my desert island albums is "Shoot Out the Lights," and probably one of yours too. I was surprised to read that album was actually recorded twice, if I read it right.
Yeah.
And that was a new one to me. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and don't need to get into all the domestic stuff around it. Tell us about the musical stuff. Why was that album recorded twice?
Well, Gerry Rafferty, who had a huge hit in the UK with a song called Baker Street, and I think he was well known in America as well. Oh. Gerry Rafferty said, "Well, let's make a record. I'll produce a record for you guys. So this is myself and Linda." And we thought, well, God, he just had this huge hit. Maybe that's a good idea. Perhaps, we can ride on his coattails and sell a few more records. So we recorded an album. It wasn't exactly the same song list as Shoot Out the Lights, but it's probably 3/4 the same songs. And we sort of hated it. It was very, very dense musically. Gerry liked to triple track things, like so the piano be triple tracked, the acoustic guitar would be triple tracked. So you had this really kind of thick sound, a very sort of Phil Spector-ish approach, and we didn't really feel that it suited the music. It felt a bit suffocating, like there wasn't any air, in the music. So we didn't really want it to come out, and we had power of veto over that. So we felt that was just a wasted project. But then Joe Boyd, who produced the Fairport record, said, let's do it on my label, Hannibal Records. We can do it really cheaply. We'll do it fast, and we'll whatever money we save, we can use to promote the North American tour. So we made the record in a week or something, and if that. And it was a slightly better selection of songs, I think. And I mean, I don't know what I feel about that record. I like the songs a lot. I still play a lot of the songs.
Yes, we do.
I'm not sure I like the production particularly, but there are things about the sound I don't like. But that's me being picky. So that so that was the record. The record came out. It got really good reviews, but didn't really sell particularly well. And then our marriage broke up during the North American tour. So that became known as the Tour from Hell for the poor musicians who had to play with us. Yeah, so that was that.
Well, let me do a reminder to our audience. You and I'll go on a bit here, but there is a Q&A box, and if people have questions, they should put them in there. And when we're done here, we'll take a look and see what others want to ask you. But let's talk a bit about performing live. You've performed, I presume, to tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people at major festivals. You've performed at small clubs for 10 or fewer. I've seen you in all those venues, to be honest with you, at one time or another. There's a great line in the book: "Give me a folk club with 30 people who treat you as nothing special." As someone who's promoted national act singer-songwriter shows in Central Ohio for 26 years, in small, intimate venues. Where would you rather be when this pandemic's over and you go out playing? Do you like the big crowds? Do you like the small clubs? Do you do them both? What's
The contrast is nice, actually. It's nice to do a bit of everything. Perhaps if you did, small clubs all the time, you'd yearn for something bigger. I mean, I love to do festivals, where you might have, 10, 20,000 people. And that can be a great experience. And it's nice to play in a small room as well. Nice to play in a theater size, like 1,000 people. I like all of it. And it depends if I'm playing acoustic or electric too. If you're playing with the band, then you can override difficulties more easily. Like if the sound is bad or something, you can just kind of plow through it in a sense, and still get the same energy to come across. If you're solo, you must have to create a kind of stillness in the room or at the festival even. You can create this kind of listening environment where people are kind of almost leaning in towards you to hear what you're saying, rather than you're playing with a band, you're kind of shoving people backwards, with their hair streaming backwards. Yeah, so the long answer to your short question is really I like everything. I like all sizes of venue.
Yeah. Again, reading the book, it's I don't know what question to ask, but it's hard not to ask a question. You write very directly about the very personal experience of embracing Sufism. I caught that there was a void in the pit of your stomach. Reality had been a puzzle. There was the existence of a riddle you could not decode, and you found that in religion. It couldn't have been easy. It would seem to me. London, England, rock and roll. You were drinking a bit at the time, but it changed your life.
Well, it did, but it was a time when a lot of people were looking for spiritual answers. It was the time of Sri Rajneesh and a lot of people going to India looking for spiritual guidance. So it wasn't really that unusual. And what I did, Sufism didn't stand out as being particularly exceptional in that sense. It was just. People say, oh, it's just another spiritual seeker, if you like. So yeah, it wasn't hard in that sense. It may be harder now if you did that in a public way.
Mm-hmm. There's a bunch of people on this call who have heard me say over the years, I really respect a great guitarist, a great vocalist, outstanding live performer. For me, it's all about the song. I just love, I'd give my left arm to be a songwriter. You write great songs. One thing I want to ask you, you mentioned in the Sandy Denny section of the book, you couldn't get her out of I don't remember how you worded it, kind of a consistent mid-tempo. Some of the songwriters that I've talked to over the years would, I think, suggest that writing the ballad, writing the slow song is relatively easy. It's hard to write the up-tempo stuff. You write great up-tempo songs. Is there a secret to that?
I think it's all hard. I'm sorry. I don't think anything's easy. Songwriting is difficult, and you have to get yourself in that frame of mind where it flows through you, and that can take a week or a couple of weeks, sometimes just to get to that starting point. It's like you're in a darkened room and you're looking for the bottom rung of a ladder, and finally you find the bottom rung, and then you can start climbing up it. But searching for the starting point is often quite hard, really. Slow ballads, I think to write a great slow ballad is very difficult. Up-tempo songs, you can write a throwaway up-tempo song. A song where you're saying, well, this is just going to be something where the guitar is going to show off a bit, so there are songs like that. More meaningful up-tempo songs I think are also difficult. It's all difficult. What can I say?
Yeah,
everything is hard.
as you wrap the book up, you talk about songwriting and And a couple of the lines that struck me, you said we write songs for pleasure, but also to understand and decode. Same word you had used earlier about the need to decode. And I ordinarily don't just ask somebody about a song, where it came from. I had the pleasure of meeting Jimi Webb. I didn't ask him what the cake was doing in the rain, but you put Beeswing out there. I mean, you talk about it in the book. Where did that song come from? That's a powerful piece of material.
The cake out in the rain comes from Sylvia Plath. He actually kind of ripped that line off, but don't tell anybody.
Really?
Yeah. Beeswing, the name Beeswing comes from a tiny village in Scotland, and I'd see it on signposts from when I was a little kid, driving with my family through Scotland, and this name Beeswing. So, and I thought that was far too good a name to not be memorialized or turned into a song somehow. So then I wrote a different song called Beeswing that wasn't very good, but I liked the title, so I kept the title and ditched the song. And the song is really, it's kind of fantasy, but I think it speaks of the attitudes in the 60s and 70s. A lot of people I went to school with, but people I knew when I was a teenager, didn't really go down the well-trodden path. That they didn't want to do what their parents did. They didn't want to go to university in some cases. They just wanted to to do something different with their lives. So that they were looking for alternatives. That they really dropped out, got into drugs in some cases, to an itinerant lifestyle. To travel the world, and in some cases it didn't come back. In the book I just describe how I talk to Sandy sometimes after shows, and she talked about her good friend Anne Briggs, who was another singer, traditional singer. And from Sandy's descriptions of Annie, I built up this picture of who she was as this kind of wild, a sort of slightly untamed creature. And another thread to the song is when I lived out in the country in England. We used to have a tramp used to come around about every 6 months. He had a kind of circuit, and he wanted to do some work, so we put him to work in the garden, and then we'd feed him for a few days and wash his clothes, and then just send him on his way with some money, and he'd tell us stories about his life, which were absolutely extraordinary, just incredible. I mean, it's like a Harold Pinter play, his life in many ways. So when I was writing the song, I kind of merged probably some aspects of Anne Briggs, some aspects of this tramp, just to tell a fictional story that also reflects, the period of the book. In fact, the 60s and 70s.
Well, you say in the book that the greatest reward for you is to have someone come up after the show and say, "I really got that song. It spoke for me." So many people talk about songs speaking to them, but I, like what you said in the book, have always loved the songs that speak for me. The ability to, capture an emotion that I've got, the universal emotion, and you do that so often.
Well, that's I think that's one of the great aims of writing songs or writing anything. It's almost just to say things that are subconscious. You're expressing the slightly under the surface ideas of the audience. And you're in the guise of entertainment, you're kind of holding these things up for everyone to look at and feel safe about because it's entertainment. So that's something I always kind of aim for, I think.
Well, let's go to the Q&A box, if I can do this, if I can read this right. And here's the first question. I'm just going to read it. I was interested to read in your book about the influence of classical composers, especially 20th century composers. You mentioned discussing, and boy, I'm not a classical music guy, Richard Debussy, with Nick Drake. I was lucky to attend Frets and Refrains a few years back, and you talked rapturously about a Maria Callas recording.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find many of your professional peers are knowledgeable, passionate, interested in, or drawing on classical music? And how does it influence your work? That's a good question. Not one I would have asked. That's a good one.
It is a good question. I think you hear a lot of classical influences all through popular music. I could start with someone like Paul McCartney, who's definitely listening to all eras of classical music. In the heyday of the Beatles, I know he was listening to Stockhausen, for instance, but also listening to Mozart. And George Martin, their producer, was classically trained musician, so he was bringing ideas onto Beatles records. And he was playing Elgar to John Lennon and saying, well, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? He'd have kind of musical evenings with John Lennon to kind of broaden his spectrum. A band like Radiohead, Johnny Greenwood's definitely heavily classically influenced. And there's a kind of a balance to it. You can't shove wholesale ideas, harmonic complexity into popular music or into folk music, or it sounds unbalanced. It sounds pretentious sometimes. So, but you can definitely take little bits and pieces. So sometimes like on a Prince record, suddenly you'll hear like a horn section, but playing something that also sounds like Charles Ives. I mean, but playing something discordant, and you think, wow, that's actually really impressive. Let me think who else. I was chatting about with Elvis Costello in a very similar situation like this the other day, where he was actually interviewing me about my book, and Elvis is very influenced by classical music. He's listened very broadly to it. Plus, his wife's a jazz singer and pianist, so he listens to a broad range of music. I think it can't hurt, to look outside your genre and soak up ideas. It doesn't hurt at all. It enriches whatever else you do. And it's okay to steal or borrow or whatever you want to call it from other people, as long as you're not just a plagiarist, and as long as you can twist it somehow to make it into your own music.
Well, I said earlier I wouldn't ask Jimmy Webb about what the cake was doing in the rain, but since someone else asked this question, it's not me asking you. Tell us about the background of Vincent Black Lightning. Where the question is, where did that song come from?
Well, it's fiction. Well, when I was a small kid, I mean, when I was 5 years old, one of my neighbors had a Vincent Black Shadow. No, it's probably a Shadow. It's probably a repeat, actually, a Vincent repeat. And I thought, God, that's the most gorgeous thing I've ever seen. It's beautiful, black, sexy motorcycle. So that stayed with me for a while, and I was casting around for British objects that had some kind of mythology to them. If you're an American songwriter, sometimes it's easy to come up with romantic place names and romantic objects. American cars can have great names, that translate very easily into a song. American place names can have a certain resonance, so that they also sound romantic and mythological in a song. So I was struggling to find British equivalents, and I thought, well, the Vincent, that's a great motorcycle. It's semi-mythological, and it would be a great thing to build a song around. You know, the Vincent's at the center of the song, and the characters kind of revolve around it. That's it. I mean, that's the reason that I chose the Vincent.
Richard, do you want to play another song tonight? Do you have another one in you before we?
I'm really concerned about the noise, so perhaps I won't. But I know everybody's asleep, and I'm just concerned that I'm going to wake up the neighbors.
We don't want you to get in trouble with your neighbors.
Yeah.
You know, you near the end of the book, you talk about the joy of playing live, and that the desire to communicate from your heart to their hearts is the strongest pull and the sweetest thing. And we all look forward to the opportunity when you and lots of other musicians are back out there playing live.
Yeah, it's been a lean time in that sense. It's been great for writing. I've really written a lot in the last year, you know, with a lot less distractions than usual. But I've had enough now. I want to get back on the road, and there are shows now coming in, which is fantastic. So you know, there's outdoor stuff coming over the summer, which I'm looking forward to, and indoor stuff starting about September, October, and next year is just jam-packed because everything from this year has moved to next year. On top of all the stuff in next year already, so I'll be working like non-stop next year.